My name is Caleb Brennan, and at 43 years old, I have spent more than half of my life serving a country that demands everything and promises nothing, rising through the grueling ranks of the United States Navy to become a 4-star admiral. Yet 3 minutes before I was set to marry the woman of my dreams at the Naval Academy Chapel in Annapolis, my own sister reminded me that to my family, I will always be nothing more than a disappointment in a fancy suit. I stood in the vestibule of the historic stone building, the humid Maryland air pressing against the heavy, starch-stiffened fabric of my full-dress white uniform, while the 4 silver stars pinned to my shoulder boards caught the midday sun filtering through the stained glass of the arched entryway. My phone vibrated against my hip, a sharp, intrusive buzz that broke the sanctuary of the moment, and when I pulled out the titanium-framed iPhone 15 Pro Max to check for an emergency from the bridge, I instead found a text from Charlotte that read, "Are you really wearing that to your wedding? Cute. Do they let you salute the cake too?" I stared at the screen for a heartbeat, the blue light reflecting off the polished gold buttons of my tunic, and I felt that familiar cold knot of 20 years of sarcasm tightening in my chest. But I simply locked the screen and slid it back into my pocket without a word because I have long since learned that you cannot negotiate with a person who views your life's work as a costume. I am a man who has commanded carrier strike groups and navigated the lethal bureaucracy of the Pentagon. A man who has looked death in the eye in the North Arabian Sea. Yet in the Brennan family hierarchy, my sister's career as a corporate consultant in Manhattan apparently affords her the right to treat a decorated flag officer like a child playing dress-up. To my left and right stood Master Chief James Hill and Senior Chief Diego Torres, 2 elite Navy SEALs who had survived the worst of the Cunard province with me a decade ago when I was just a lieutenant commander leading a joint task force that nearly didn't come home. They weren't just my ushers. They had insisted on being my unofficial bodyguards today, standing in their own crisp dress blues with chests heavy with bronze stars and purple hearts, their presence a silent, lethal testament to the loyalty I had earned in the mud and blood of actual combat. Hill, a mountain of a man with a jawline carved from granite and eyes that never stopped scanning the perimeter, caught the flicker of my expression as I put the phone away, and he leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that could jumpstart a dead engine. "Admiral, is there a problem with the perimeter, or do I need to escort someone to the parking lot before the music starts?" he asked, his hand instinctively twitching toward where a sidearm would usually sit on his belt. And I realized then that while my biological sister was busy mocking the uniform I had bled for, these men would have taken a bullet for me without a second thought. The chapel smelled of ancient wood, expensive lilies that cost us nearly $5,000 to arrange, and the faint metallic scent of the ceremonial swords held by the honor guard waiting just outside the heavy oak doors. I looked at the gold braid on my sleeves and the scrambled eggs on the visor of my cover resting on the stone bench beside me, thinking of the 2024 midnight black Cadillac Escalade that had just pulled up to the curb carrying my parents, who likely viewed this entire ceremony as a tedious interruption to their social calendar. But I am getting ahead of myself, for to understand why my own flesh and blood felt comfortable insulting a man of my station on his wedding day, you have to understand the deep-seated resentment that festers in a family where money is the only metric of success and service is seen as a lack of ambition. I stood there, my Omega Seamaster ticking away the final seconds of my bachelorhood, surrounded by the echoes of naval history and the unwavering support of 2 of the most dangerous men in the world, knowing that when those doors opened, I wasn't just walking toward a bride, but away from a lifetime of being undervalued by people who didn't deserve to share my name. Family isn't about who shares your blood, it is about who stands in the breach with you when the world turns cold. And as the organ began to swell with the first notes of the processional, I realized that I had already found my true kin in the men standing guard at my side. Growing up in our colonial-style brick estate in Richmond, Virginia, the air was always thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and the crushing weight of a favoritism that carved a financial and emotional chasm between my sister and me. Charlotte was the undisputed golden child of the Brennan household, a magnetic socialite who seemed to glide through the hallways of her private academy wearing $1,200 Mikimoto pearls to student council meetings as if they were costume jewelry. My father, a high-ranking defense contractor who spent his days negotiating multi-million-dollar government acquisitions for Lockheed Martin, adored her with a fervor that bordered on worship, viewing her as the living embodiment of the Brennan legacy. While he viewed me as the icebox, a quiet, intense and ultimately invisible presence in the corner of the dining room, he spared no expense to ensure Charlotte's ascent was frictionless. I remember the day he signed a check for $50,000 just for her private media coaching and poise lessons, an investment he justified by saying she was destined for the world stage, yet he couldn't recall the name of the commanding officer who had written my primary recommendation for the academy. But I am getting ahead of myself, for while Charlotte was being groomed for a life of cocktail parties and corporate boards, I was learning the value of a dollar in the most literal sense possible. At 16, I was working 30 hours a week at Pleasance Hardware on West Broad Street, my hands calloused from hauling bags of Quikrete and restocking heavy zinc bolts while my classmates were spending their summers at the Country Club of Virginia. I never asked my father for a single dime, not even when I needed to buy my first set of Bates tactical boots or the thick annotated study guides for the Naval Academy entrance exams that cost nearly $400 with overnight shipping. I can still recall the smell of sawdust and motor oil in that hardware store, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled luxury of our home where my father would boast about Charlotte's latest social triumph while I sat silently, calculating how many more shifts I needed to cover the cost of my physical fitness testing fees. The inequality wasn't just about the money. It was about the fundamental belief that my ambitions were a hobby while hers were a mandate. My father once laughed when he saw my application to Annapolis sitting on the mahogany desk in his study, telling me that the military was for boys who couldn't cut it in the real world of high finance, a comment that stung more than any physical blow ever could. He didn't see the 4 a.m. runs I took through the humid Richmond streets or the way I stayed up until midnight under a dim desk lamp mastering multivariable calculus while Charlotte was out at late-night mixers in her brand-new BMW 3 Series. I was building a foundation of discipline and grit in the shadows, fueled by the cold realization that if I wanted a seat at any table, I would have to build the chair myself. By the time I left for induction day, I had saved exactly $6,422 from my hardware store wages, enough to ensure I would never have to call home and ask for help with the things my father's peers bought for their children without a second thought. I left that house with a single duffel bag and a heart hardened by the knowledge that I was the outlier, the son who traded the comfort of a trust fund for the weight of a duty they would never understand. Looking back from the vantage point of my 4 stars, I realized that the chasm between us was never about the pearls or the boots. It was about the fact that Charlotte was taught how to be seen, while I was forced to learn how to lead. Family isn't the bank account that funds your lifestyle. It is the character you forge when the people who should believe in you most are the ones waiting for you to fail. The ultimate betrayal didn't come with a shout or a grand theatrical gesture, but with the hollow, deafening silence of a mailbox that remained empty for 3 agonizing weeks during the spring of my senior year at Douglas S. Freeman High School. I had poured every ounce of my soul into my application to the United States Naval Academy, maintaining a 4.2 GPA while working double shifts at the hardware store and training until my lungs burned in the humid Virginia air. Yet as my classmates celebrated their acceptances to Ivy League universities, my blue and gold packet from Annapolis never arrived. I remember sitting at the mahogany dining table, staring at the mail pile as my father praised Charlotte for her early admission to a prestigious communications program that he had essentially bought for her with a $60,000 donation, while I felt like a ghost haunting my own home. The truth only surfaced on a Tuesday afternoon in late April when I went into Charlotte's room to retrieve a stapler and found her cherrywood desk drawer slightly ajar, revealing the corner of a thick, official envelope embossed with the Department of the Navy seal. My heart stopped as I pulled it out, finding not only my official appointment letter, dated 3 weeks prior, but also my original high school transcripts and the glowing recommendation from a retired Rear Admiral that she had intercepted from the morning mail and buried under a stack of Vogue magazines. When she walked in and saw me holding the evidence of her sabotage, she didn't apologize or look ashamed. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, adjusted one of her $1,400 earrings, and told me with a chilling, practiced calm that she was doing me a favor because I simply wasn't officer material and would only embarrass the family by failing out in the first month. I didn't scream, I didn't throw the desk, and I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing a single tear, because in moment, the last flickering ember of familial loyalty in my chest finally went cold. I realized that my sister wasn't just a spoiled socialite. She was a predator who viewed my dreams as a threat to her own spotlight. And my father's silence from the downstairs study told me everything I needed to know about whose future actually mattered in that house. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of icy, calculated focus, reapplying for a deferred entry in secret using a P.O. box I paid for with my hardware store earnings and coordinating with the admissions office through a burner phone I had purchased for $80 at a local Best Buy. On the morning I was set to leave for the induction day that I had secured entirely on my own merit, I didn't wake anyone up or offer a sentimental farewell to the people who shared my DNA but none of my values. I packed a single olive drab duffel bag with the few essentials I truly owned, my Bates boots, a few changes of clothes and the pocket watch my grandfather had left me, and walked out of that 5-bedroom colonial estate without looking back at the manicured lawn or the luxury cars in the driveway. I drove my beat-up truck to the bus station, leaving the keys in the ignition with a note for the next owner, and began a decade of total, unwavering silence that would see me transform from a discarded son into a commander of men. They didn't deserve my goodbye, and they certainly didn't deserve to witness the man I was about to become. Because family isn't the people who try to clip your wings before you've even had a chance to fly. As the bus pulled away from the Richmond skyline, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that no amount of military gear could ever replicate, knowing that the only person who could define my worth was the man I saw in the mirror. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. in a windowless, soundproofed briefing room at Naval Station Norfolk, the air smelling of ozone floor wax and the stale metallic tang of a lukewarm cup of $1 black coffee I'd pulled from a vending machine in the hallway. I sat alone at the massive mahogany conference table, the blue light from my secured tactical tablet casting long, jagged shadows against the acoustic foam walls while the rest of the base slept under the heavy, humid blanket of a Virginia summer night. My thumb hovered over the glass screen of my personal phone where a notification had popped up, revealing a high-resolution photo Charlotte had posted just 3 hours earlier from a black tie gala at the Jefferson Hotel in Richmond. She looked radiant in a $6,000 emerald silk gown, clutching a champagne flute and smiling for a photographer with a caption that read, "So proud to always support our brave troops and the sacrifices my family makes for this country." The hypocrisy of it tasted more bitter than the dregs of my coffee, considering she hadn't sent a single text, made a 5-minute phone call, or even acknowledged my promotion to captain 3 years ago, yet here she was, using my service as social currency to bolster her image among the Richmond elite. I stared at her perfectly manicured hand in the photo and felt a cold, surgical clarity wash over me, the kind of absolute focus I usually reserved for coordinating carrier-based flight operations in contested airspace. I realized in that quiet, refrigerated room that family loyalty had become a lopsided transaction I could no longer afford to fund with my silence or my tolerance. I opened a split-screen interface on my tactical tablet, the same device I used to track ship movements and logistics, and began to mentally map out the architecture of my life as if it were a battlefield. On the left side of the digital divide sat the remnants of the Brennan name, a sister who only remembered I existed when she needed a patriotic anecdote for a dinner party, and a father who viewed my medals as a reflection of his own greatness rather than the result of my blood and sweat. On the right side I listed the names of the men currently stationed 3 decks below me or deployed across the globe, men like Master Chief Hill and Senior Chief Torres who had dragged me out of a burning Humvee in the middle of a desert without ever asking what my last name was. These were the men who knew the exact way I took my coffee, the sound of my gait on a steel deck, and the weight of the secrets we carried from missions that officially never happened. The contrast was staggering. On one hand I had a biological tie that functioned like a parasite, feeding on my accomplishments while offering nothing but sabotage and sarcasm, and on the other, I had a brotherhood forged in the literal fires of combat where loyalty was a life-or-death mandate. I took a slow sip of the cold coffee, the caffeine doing nothing to mask the exhaustion of a 20-hour shift, and I made a definitive command decision that no amount of shared DNA could override. I reached out and silenced every notification from Charlotte's social media profiles, effectively decommissioning her from the theater of my personal life, and focused instead on the tactical readiness reports for the men who actually stood the watch with me. The choice was no longer difficult. It was a matter of survival and integrity. I closed the tablet, the screen clicking into darkness, and stood up to walk back out into the corridors of the command center, leaving the ghosts of Richmond behind in the shadows of that briefing room. Family isn't the name on your birth certificate. It is the group of people who are willing to bleed in the trenches beside you when the rest of the world is busy taking photos of the view. The decision was made with the same cold, surgical precision I used to coordinate a Tomahawk missile strike from the bridge of a destroyer, and so I began to collect my arsenal, though this time the weapons weren't kinetic or explosive, but rather a series of ironclad legal boundaries and a newly forged definition of family. I found myself sitting in the mahogany-clad office of Mr. Sterling, a high-end estate attorney in downtown Norfolk whose workspace smelled of expensive Italian leather, old parchment, and a hint of the $80 an ounce Macallan Scotch he kept in a crystal decanter on his sideboard. Sterling was a man who understood that power was often found in the fine print, and as I sat across from him in my working khakis, the contrast between my utilitarian life and his opulent surroundings felt like a necessary bridge between the man I was and the man I was protecting. I handed him a thick cream-colored manila folder that I had mentally dubbed my dossier of reality, a meticulously organized collection of every mocking email, every dismissive text message, and every intercepted document Charlotte had sent or stolen over the last 20 years. This wasn't a gesture of petty revenge, but a tactical necessity to ensure that when the time came for me to disappear from their lives entirely, there would be no legal or moral ambiguity left to exploit. Sterling flipped through the pages with a neutral expression, his gold fountain pen hovering over a series of official Navy forms as I instructed him to begin the total erasure of Charlotte Brennan from my future. We started with the heavy hitters. I officially removed my sister as the primary beneficiary of my military life insurance and my personal SLI policy, effectively stripping her of any claim to the death benefits that had once been her silent inheritance. I watched as Sterling's pen moved across the paper, revoking her access to my survivor benefits and my private investment portfolio, a collection of Vanguard index funds and real estate holdings currently valued at approximately $1.4 million in liquid assets and accrued benefits. For years she had mocked my uniform while quietly banking on the fact that if I fell in some forgotten corner of the globe, she would be the one to collect the flag and the check. But today that safety net was shredded in a matter of minutes. Every signature felt like a physical weight being lifted from my chest, a cleansing fire that burned away the parasitic connection she had maintained under the guise of siblinghood. I redirected those funds to a trust for the families of fallen sailors from my command, ensuring that the wealth I earned through sacrifice would go to people who actually understood the meaning of the word. Sterling looked up from the final document, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of professional respect as he realized I wasn't just changing a will, I was conducting a total decommissioning of my past life. The sound of the heavy stamps hitting the paper was more satisfying than any medal ceremony I had ever attended, a final percussive end to 2 decades of emotional extortion. I left the office and walked back to my 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked at the curb, the engine idling with a low, powerful hum that mirrored the steady rhythm of my own heart. I was no longer the icebox or the ignored son. I was a man who had built a fortress around the people who truly mattered, leaving the golden child to find her own way in a world where her brother's blood was no longer for sale. Family isn't a debt you owe to the people who try to break you. It is a fortress you build with the people who help you stand, and for the first time in my life the walls were finally secure. The reception was held at an exclusive waterfront venue overlooking the Severn River, where the glass walls of the ballroom reflected the shimmering Chesapeake Bay and the moonlight bounced off the polished brass of 200 high-ranking guests, including 80 active-duty Navy SEALs and a dozen Pentagon officials whose collective authority could shift the geopolitical axis of the hemisphere. I stood near the tiered white cake, my hand resting on the small of my new wife's back, feeling the solid weight of my dress sword against my hip and the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished, until the heavy double doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a theatrical flourish that didn't belong in a room full of warriors. Charlotte marched in uninvited, draped in a $3,000 champagne-colored Vera Wang gown that was clearly designed to outshine the bride, and she wasn't alone. Trailing behind her was a 2-man camera crew equipped with Sony FX6 rigs and boom mics, ready to capture what she evidently planned to frame as a heartwarming human interest segment for her news network. I watched with a cold, detached fascination as she began to strut through the crowd of elite operators and master chiefs, acting less like a guest and more like the guest of honor who had personally choreographed every success of my 20-year career. She moved from table to table, her voice projecting with a practiced, Mid-Atlantic news anchor trill as she told a table of decorated special warfare officers how she had practically raced me in Richmond and how my stoic leadership style was a direct result of the emotional discipline she had instilled in me during our childhood. To the Vice Admiral sitting near the head table, she leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for half the room to hear. claiming that she was the one who had spent countless nights helping me study for the academy entrance exams and that her father's political connections were the only reason my application hadn't been buried in a pile of mid-tier candidates. The audacity of her performance was staggering. A masterclass in narcissistic revisionist history performed in a room full of men and women who specialized in spotting a lie from 1,000 yards away. She gestured for her cameraman to get a close-up of her touching a display of my early service medals, her face contorting into a mask of maternal pride for the lens while she simultaneously ignored the fact that she hadn't spoken to me in 5 years except to send mocking texts about my uniform. I could see Master Chief Hill standing near the bar, his eyes tracking the camera crew with the predatory stillness of a sniper who had identified a breach in the perimeter, his hand casually resting on the lapel of his dress blues as he waited for my signal to neutralize the intrusion. The air in the ballroom seemed to thicken with the scent of her expensive French perfume and the mounting tension of 80 SEALs who were beginning to realize that the woman claiming to be the architect of my soul was the same person I had warned them about in the briefing rooms of Norfolk. Charlotte reached for a microphone she had brought in her clutch, clearly preparing to interrupt the planned toasts with a televised tribute that would center herself as the tragic, supportive sister of a war hero, all while the red recording light on the camera flickered like a warning flare in the dark. I didn't move and I didn't break my smile because I knew that the dossier of reality I had compiled with Mr. Sterling was sitting in my 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe and that the legal firewall I had built was about to collide with her carefully constructed fantasy. But I am getting ahead of myself, for as she signaled her crew to start filming her grand monologue, she failed to realize that this wasn't a Richmond garden party where her charms could mask her malice. This was a room full of people who valued truth above all else. I felt the steady pulse of my Omega Seamaster against my wrist, marking the final seconds of her charade, and I realized that the greatest victory wasn't just in the medals on my chest, but in the fact that I no longer felt the need to scream at her to stop. I simply looked at Hill and gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of my head, a command for the Master Chief to execute the final phase of our security protocol. Family isn't the person who stands in front of a camera to claim your glory. It is the person who stands in the shadows to protect your peace. And as the SEALs began to close the gap between the bar and the camera crew, I knew Charlotte's broadcast was about to go permanently off the air. The moment of execution didn't require a raised voice or a dramatic flourish. Only the cold, unyielding application of the truth in a room full of people trained to recognize it as the ultimate weapon. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, the silver microphone feeling surprisingly light in my hand as the ambient chatter of 200 guests died down into a heavy, expectant silence that seemed to vibrate against the glass walls of the Severn River venue. Charlotte was standing near her camera crew, her face tilted at a perfect 45-degree angle to catch the light, her hand already reaching for her own glass as if she were the one about to receive a standing ovation from the Pentagon elite. I looked directly at her, not with anger, but with the detached professional gaze of an admiral conducting a final damage assessment, and I began by simply reaching into my pocket and pulling out my phone to read the text message she had sent me at 11:24 a.m. that very morning. "Are you really wearing that to your wedding? Cute. Do they let you salute the cake too?" I read the words clearly, my voice amplified by the $12,000 Bose surround system until they echoed off the ceiling, and I watched as the practiced, telegenic smile on Charlotte's face froze into a jagged mask of porcelain. The room didn't just go quiet. It went cold, a specialized kind of military silence where 80 Navy SEALs instinctively shifted their weight, their eyes narrowing as they realized the woman who had spent the last hour claiming to be my biggest supporter was the one mocking the uniform they lived and died in. But I was far from finished with the briefing, and with a small tap on my tactical tablet, the 3 massive 4K projection screens behind the head table flickered to life, displaying a high-resolution scan of the original Naval Academy appointment letter she had intercepted and hidden in her cherrywood desk 25 years ago. I didn't let her speak, instead directing the attention of the vice admirals and joint chiefs in attendance to the documented evidence of her sabotage, including the sworn affidavit from our old high school registrar and the time-stamped emails she had sent to her producer just last week, outlining a plan to monetize my military service for a sensationalized news segment she called My Brother the Hero. The dossier of reality was no longer a private file. It was a public broadcast of her 30-year campaign of narcissism and professional interference, showing the exact moments she tried to block my transcripts and the subsequent messages where she begged for my security clearance details to impress her corporate donors in Richmond. The golden girl of Virginia social circles was being dismantled in real time, her $3,000 designer gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume under the harsh, unforgiving light of the evidence being projected for the most powerful people in the defense industry to see. I looked at the camera crew she had brought to film her triumph, and I saw the cameraman slowly lower his rig, his face flushing with a mix of secondary embarrassment and the realization that he was filming a social suicide rather than a tribute. Charlotte's hand began to tremble, the champagne in her flute sloshing against the rim as she looked around the room and saw not the admiration she craved, but the stony, disgusted expressions of men like Master Chief Hill, who viewed her not as a guest, but as a hostile element that had finally been neutralized. I set the microphone down on the linen tablecloth with a soft, final thud, the sound of a lid closing on a coffin, and I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the public humiliation of a fraud, but the fact that her opinion no longer had the power to reach me. Family isn't the person who uses your blood to build their brand. It is the truth that remains when the cameras are turned off and the parasites are escorted to the parking lot. As the SEALs began to quietly close in to lead her and her crew toward the exit, I turned back to my wife, knowing that for the first time in my life, the only people left in the room were the ones who truly belonged there. The fallout from that night at the Annapolis waterfront was as swift and surgical as a precision airstrike, dismantling Charlotte's carefully curated life within a staggering 48 hours as the high-ranking Pentagon officials and media moguls in attendance that evening did exactly what people in power do when they smell a reputational contagion: they distance themselves with ruthless efficiency. By Monday morning, the luxury lifestyle brands and pharmaceutical sponsors that funded her news segment had pulled their contracts, citing the public scandal of her attempted stolen valor by association and the undeniable evidence of her ethical bankruptcy that had been broadcast to the very elite she desperately tried to impress. I sat in my home office overlooking the quiet morning mist of the Severn River, the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country cooling in the driveway after a morning run to the base, as I watched the digital ripples of her collapse through a series of frantic unread emails from her legal representation. She was suddenly buried under $85,000 in high-interest credit card debt and a lifestyle she could no longer subsidize with my name or my father's diminishing influence, finding herself in a world where there was no longer a hero brother to bail her out of the consequences of her own malice. I didn't feel the surge of petty triumph I might have expected as a younger man, but rather a profound leaden sense of relief that the tactical theater of our relationship had finally reached its permanent ceasefire. I drafted one final communication from my secure terminal, not a heartfelt letter or a plea for reconciliation, but a formal and ironclad cease and desist order prepared by Mr. Sterling that outlined the criminal penalties for any further attempt to contact me or use my likeness for her commercial gain. I pressed the send button with the same steady, unwavering finger I had used to authorize tactical deployments in the South China Sea, effectively erasing the last digital bridge between the life I was building and the shadow I had left behind in Richmond. My home was silent, filled only with the scent of fresh coffee and the distant rhythmic sound of the tide against the pier, a sanctuary built on a foundation of discipline and genuine affection rather than the transactional loyalty of my upbringing. My wife, Miles, walked into the room and rested a hand on my shoulder, her presence a grounding force that reminded me that I was finally surrounded by people who saw the man behind the 4 stars rather than the assets he could provide. We spent the afternoon in the quiet, focused routine that defines my life, preparing for my next deployment with the knowledge that my home front was finally secure and that the perimeter I had spent 20 years defending was no longer being breached from within. I looked at a framed photograph on my desk of Hill, Torres, and myself after a grueling mission in the Mediterranean, realizing that these were the men who had taught me the true definition of a brother, men who asked for nothing but my trust and gave everything in return. I am an admiral in the United States Navy, a man responsible for the lives of thousands and the movement of billions of dollars in military hardware, yet my greatest achievement is the simple, quiet air I now breathe as a man who owes no one anything. Family isn't the ghost that haunts your achievements with the weight of unearned expectations. It is the deliberate choice of who you allow to stand beside you when the smoke clears and the world goes silent. As the sun set over the Chesapeake Bay, casting long golden fingers across the water, I realized that for the first time in 43 years, I was finally home, and the only stars that mattered were the ones on my shoulders and the ones reflected in the peaceful water of my own life. I sat on the edge of the mahogany deck overlooking the Severn River, the evening air cooling my skin and causing the old shrapnel scars on my right shoulder to thrum with a dull, familiar ache that served as a physical map of a life my sister could never comprehend. In the quiet moments between the chaos of command and the peace of my new marriage, I found myself reflecting on the Iron Wing nickname I had earned during a Black Ops extraction in the scorched mountains of Yemen, a title that carried more weight in my soul than the 4 silver stars currently resting on my dress uniform. I closed my eyes and could still smell the acrid scent of burning jet fuel and the metallic tang of blood in the dirt as I remembered the exact moment I lunged through a hail of small arms fire to reach a 24-year-old corporal named Bryson, whose leg had been shattered by an IED blast that had turned our extraction point into a kill zone. I didn't think about my rank, my future, or the Brennan legacy as I threw his dead weight over my shoulder, the white-hot searing of jagged metal tearing into my own flesh as I shielded his body with mine, dragging us both toward the hovering shadow of an MH-60 Black Hawk while the world exploded around us in a cacophony of thunder and dust. That $0 act of raw, unvarnished bravery meant more to me than every single Cartier watch, designer suit, or hollow luxury gift Charlotte had ever purchased using our father's Lockheed Martin dividends to buy my silence or my affection. It was in that moment of absolute, terrifying clarity that I realized respect is not something you inherit through a trust fund or a prestigious last name, but something that is forged in the suffocating darkness of a crisis when no cameras are rolling and no socialites are watching to applaud your performance. Bryson had survived, and every year on the anniversary of that extraction he sends me a simple handwritten note that I keep in a locked drawer of my desk. A piece of paper that holds more value than the entire $1.4 million in assets I had just stripped from my sister's reach. Charlotte had spent her entire life trying to manufacture a version of me that she could use to bolster her own status. Yet she never understood that the man she claimed to have raised was actually born in the mud and the fire of a foreign desert where the only thing that mattered was whether you were willing to bleed for the person standing to your left. I looked down at my hands, the knuckles scarred and the grip steady, realizing that the Iron Wing wasn't a brand or a media segment, but a testament to a character built one agonizing brick at a time while she was busy polishing her image in the mirrors of Richmond. The contrast was final and absolute. She lived in a world of curated reflections and stolen credit, while I lived in a world of heavy rucksacks and the silent, unwavering bond of men who had looked into the abyss and didn't blink. I took a slow breath of the Maryland salt air, feeling the tension finally leave my jaw as the realization settled into my bones that I had finally outrun the reach of her narcissism and my father's cold expectations. I am a man who was forged in the dark, tempered by the weight of responsibility, and polished by the loyalty of brothers who would have died to keep me standing, a truth that no amount of her social media spin could ever hope to tarnish. Respect is the only currency that matters in the end, and as the stars began to poke through the darkening sky over Annapolis, I knew I was the wealthiest man I had ever known because I had earned every single one of them. Family is not the people who share your blood. It is the people who are willing to spill theirs so that you can find your way home. My name is Caleb Brennan, and while the world sees the 4 stars on my shoulders and the rigid posture of a man who commands thousands, my true legacy is being written in the quiet, unglamorous corners of a secret project I call Operation Glass House. I have taken the $1.4 million in diverted inheritance and military assets that Charlotte once viewed as her personal safety net and funneled every cent into a mental health support network designed to catch the soldiers who fall through the cracks of a bureaucratic system. Every Thursday night, I trade my polished full-dress whites for a faded navy sweatshirt and a pair of worn-in jeans, driving my 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe away from the pristine gated communities of Annapolis toward a nondescript community center in a working-class neighborhood of Norfolk. The room we meet in is the polar opposite of the Brennan estate. It is a space defined by flickering fluorescent tubes that hum with a rhythmic persistence, walls painted a dull shade of institutional beige, and a collection of mismatched, dented ceramic mugs that have seen more coffee and more tears than any 5-star restaurant in Richmond. I sit in a circle of folding metal chairs with young recruits, boys barely 20 years old who have seen things in the Euphrates Valley or the mountains of Tajikistan that have shattered their sense of self, and I listen to them talk about the invisible shrapnel they carry in their minds. There are no cameras here, no $3,000 designer gowns, and certainly no teleprompters feeding us curated lines of fake empathy. There is only the raw, metallic scent of industrial cleaner and the heavy, honest silence of men trying to rebuild their souls. I remember one young corporal, a kid from Ohio who couldn't look me in the eye because he thought his PTSD made him a failure, and I spent 4 hours just sitting there with him, drinking a cup of bitter, lukewarm Folgers coffee that cost me nothing but gave him everything. The contrast between this sanctuary and the bright, artificial lights of Charlotte's television studio is a staggering indictment of the life I narrowly escaped, for while she is currently begging for scraps of airtime to maintain a facade of relevance, I am witnessing the slow, agonizing process of human resurrection. Charlotte used to tell me that I was cold and unfeeling, the icebox who didn't understand the nuances of social grace. Yet here I am, providing the very emotional scaffolding she claimed I lacked, funded by the money she tried to steal. I look at these young men, their hands shaking as they grip their chipped mugs, and I see the reflection of the boy I was in Richmond, ignored, undervalued, and searching for a purpose that didn't involve a price tag. Operation Glasshouse isn't about public relations or building a brand. It is about shattering the mirrors of narcissism that my family tried to trap me in and replacing them with clear windows through which these soldiers can finally see a future. I pay the rent for this space, the salaries for 3 specialized trauma counselors, and the emergency bills for families who can't afford groceries, all through the trust one established with Mr. Sterling, ensuring that every dollar Charlotte lost becomes a lifeline for someone who actually sacrificed for this country. As I walk out of that building at midnight, the cool Virginia air filling my lungs, I feel a sense of fulfillment that no medal ceremony or promotional gala could ever provide. Respect isn't something you perform for a television audience. It is a quiet, steady flame you keep lit for the people who are walking through the dark. And as I drive back to my wife and my true brothers in arms, I know that my father's money is finally doing something honorable for the first time in history. Family isn't the people who watch you succeed from a distance. It is the people who sit with you in the dented chairs of a basement until you're strong enough to stand up on your own. The final moment of closure arrived not with a televised fanfare or a public declaration of victory, but in the form of a simple cream-colored envelope waiting for me in the quiet sanctuary of my study at 6 a.m., the morning light just beginning to bleed over the Severn River and illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air of a home that finally feels like a fortress. I opened the letter with the same steady, calloused hands that had once hauled bags of concrete at a hardware store in Richmond and later navigated the lethal complexities of a carrier strike group, finding inside a handwritten note from a young corporal who had attended my support sessions at Operation Glasshouse. He didn't use flowery language or the corporate buzzwords Charlotte favored. He simply told me that my leadership of silence, the way I sat with him in those dented metal chairs without judgment or the need for a camera crew, had been the only thing that kept him from taking his own life during his darkest week of transition. I sat there for a long moment, the hum of the central heating and the distant call of a heron the only sounds in the room, and I felt a profound, quiet weight settle into my chest that no amount of silver stars or navy crosses could ever replicate. I stood up and walked over to my heavy leather uniform binder, the one that contains the paper trail of a 43-year journey, and I carefully slid his letter into a clear plastic sleeve right next to my original, yellowing deployment orders from 2 decades ago. This binder is my true archive, a collection of missions, losses, and small, unrecorded mercies that stand in stark contrast to the hollow digital headlines and curated social media feeds that define the life my sister is still desperately trying to salvage. I don't need a primetime news segment or a $3,000 gown to validate my existence, because a legacy isn't something you perform for an audience. It is the silent, enduring impact you leave on the souls of the people who stood in the breach beside you. I turned toward the full-length mirror in the corner of the room, my reflection staring back at me with a clarity that used to terrify me but now brings a sense of absolute surgical peace. The full-dress white uniform was sharp, the fabric crisp and the gold buttons gleaming under the soft LED lighting of the room, and as I adjusted the 4 silver stars on my shoulder boards, I knew with every fiber of my being that they had been earned in the mud, the fire, and the silence, rather than inherited through a name I no longer recognize as my own. The man inside the uniform is no longer the icebox or the ignored son waiting for a father's approval or a sister's mercy. He is a commander who has navigated the most treacherous waters of all, the ones that run through his own history, and emerged on the other side with his integrity intact. I looked at my Omega Seamaster, the seconds ticking away with a rhythmic mechanical certainty, and I realized that the debt I once thought I owed to the Brennan name has been paid in full, cancelled by the very silence they tried to use as a weapon against me. I am at peace with the man I have become, a man who knows that family isn't the blood that betrays you in a desk drawer, but the brotherhood that sustains you in a windowless briefing room at 2 a.m. I stepped away from the mirror and walked toward the kitchen where my wife was waiting, leaving the dossier of reality and the ghosts of Richmond behind me for the last time. My story doesn't need a headline because it is written in the lives of the men I've saved and the quiet dignity of a life lived on my own terms. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I closed the door to my study, I knew I had finally found exactly where I belong. The final echoes of the chapel bells faded into the crisp Annapolis air as I led my wife toward the curb, where my vintage 1989 silver Porsche 911 Carrera sat waiting, its air-cooled engine humming with a low mechanical purr that felt more like a heartbeat than a machine. I settled into the driver's seat, the smell of aged black leather and high-octane fuel enveloping me in a familiar comfort, and as I gripped the steering wheel with the same steady hands that had once guided a destroyer through a Category 5 hurricane, I felt the finality of the day settle into my bones. I shifted the car into first gear, the linkage clicking into place with a surgical precision that mirrored the way I had restructured my entire existence. And as we began to pull away from the stone arches of the Naval Academy, I adjusted the chrome-rimmed rearview mirror with a deliberate flick of my finger. I didn't look back at the chapel doors or the frantic, desperate silhouette of Charlotte standing on the sidewalk, her $3,000 gown now nothing more than a shroud for a reputation that had burned to the ground in front of the very people she worshipped. Instead, I focused my gaze on the asphalt ribbon of the road ahead, a path that stretched toward a future built not with the fragile bricks of a family name or the hollow promises of a trust fund, but with the unyielding, diamond-hard truth of the man I had fought to become. I had spent 43 years navigating a labyrinth of emotional sabotage and calculated neglect. But as the needle on the tachometer climbed and the silver Porsche surged forward into the afternoon sun, I realized that I had finally successfully completed the most dangerous extraction of my career. I had built a fortress of a life, one where the walls were reinforced by the loyalty of men who had bled for me and the love of a woman who knew the weight of my silence, leaving no room for the parasites who viewed my sacrifice as their own personal brand. The hum of the tires against the road was the only soundtrack to a victory that didn't need a headline or a televised tribute, for the greatest triumph was the simple, staggering realization that I no longer needed to look back to see if I was being followed. I had cut away the rot of my past to save the life I had worked 20 years to earn, and as the Maryland coastline blurred into a streak of blue and green, I felt the air in my lungs finally turn clear. I was an admiral, a husband, and a brother-in-arms, but above all, I was finally a man who was the sole architect of his own horizon, driving toward a destiny that belonged to no one but me.